Hi there, guys. Welcome to the .NET Roundabout in association with ASOS. You join us for the last .NET Roundabout of the season, as we're taking December off. We have with us Steve Withey, who's correct me if I'm wrong, Steve. Your job title, are you principal or lead?
Principal software engineer.
Principal software engineer at ASOS. We were supposed to have another speaker join us this evening, but unfortunately, work commitments had to take priority, and they have kind of dropped out at the last minute to unfortunately sort of backfill them, if you like. So I am sorry about that, but we will be looking to get back to the more traditional meetup in person from next year. So I think that's going to be really impactful, and obviously I know ASOS certainly really keen to show off the revamped office, which is now going to be a couple of years old, what with COVID, but it does look fantastic, and you've got an amazing space down there for meetups, and so I think that's really where we want to get to, is getting some more sort of in-person live events going on, and maybe a little bit more interactive with some live demos and that sort of stuff if we can. But it does at least enable you to have more time on the mic, and go into as much detail as you like with your talk. So obviously, for anyone watching, feel free to ask questions in the chat, in the comments, and after Steve's talk, we'll go through any questions people have got, and yeah, obviously this talk will be is obviously being recorded and will stay on YouTube if you want to share with anyone. Likewise, we do have all the socials, as you can see there in the bottom of the page. So feel free to connect with us on socials. We also have a Slack group for anyone who wants to join that, and the Slack invite link should be found on the meetup page as well. So if anyone wants to get involved in that, they're more than welcome to join. But just finally, I'm just going to little plug, because this isn't my day job. I am a recruiter for a software development and agile delivery consultancy. So if you guys want any friendly recruitment services in tech, then hit us up, because we're very nice, and I'd like to think we'll do a good job for you guys. So if anyone needs us, give us a shout. But I'll hand over to Steve now, and look forward to hearing your talk, Steve.
Thanks very much, Rob. Cool. So, hi, I'm Steve Withey. I'm Principal Software Engineer at ASOS, and today I wanted to talk a bit about building secure web applications. First of all, what we'll cover is quite a huge, well, it's a really huge subject, security, and I can't go into depth in the amount of time, even if I doubled the length of this talk. I couldn't go into all the depth that I'd want to, but really what I want to do today is signpost the sort of things you should be looking at when building a security culture in your engineering practices and in your teams and in your organization. So I'll do a really quick introduction, and then I'm going to run through some of the basics, then talk about protecting the edge, the sort of public facing side of your applications, and then also talk a bit more about hardening your application from a software development lifecycle perspective. So first off, just a little bit about me. So I'm a software engineer, have been for well over 16 years now, the entirety of my career. I've spent over 5 years at ASOS. I'm a husband and father of 2 kids, who hopefully won't interrupt me during this. And I'm passionate about pizza. This is one weird thing that I've got really into over the last couple of years, making it from scratch, and love it. And finally, I'm really passionate about security, and I genuinely do want to try and find ways of contributing to making the internet a safer place. And so that's where sort of my love of security comes from, is really just around protecting myself and other people who are using the internet. So to sort of start off, really, I want to talk about how we at ASOS have been building a security-focused culture and mindset, and try and point out or share with you some of the areas that you should be looking at to do the same. So security should be augmented into the software development lifecycle. It shouldn't be at the end of it. It shouldn't be the last line of defense in a process that you as engineers follow. So to achieve that, really, I suggest having security champions. If you haven't got a security team, starting to look at building one, but certainly at the very least having security champions within your teams to help to build deeper knowledge on the subject, and to work with you as engineers to further improve your code and your systems that you're building. So to achieve that, you need to really sort of learn the fundamentals, the basics, things, and implement them as well. So I'll talk about those in a moment. But also learn a bit about the threats, the type of things and types of attacks that you could be subject to. So that could be through doing things like threat modeling, or even learning about hacking in general, and that really is a good way of having practical experience with the types of risks. Once you've sort of learned about or understood some of the threats, also obviously learn about how to mitigate them, how to protect yourselves from them happening, or yourself exposing those issues. And then it's really, really important to make sure that you don't have a blame culture, and learn from mistakes. Security is a constantly changing environment. There are new vulnerabilities found all the time. You cannot always be on top of it. So don't feel bad if someone finds an issue that has been there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years and no one's noticed it before. If you can find it and not a hacker, hopefully, you learn from that and learn to protect yourselves better moving forward. And finally, sort of move towards a zero trust model. It's definitely quite a difficult thing to get to. I think especially in engineering teams where people are very, especially in smaller companies, even where people are very much used to having complete freedom to do a lot and have a lot of access to things. It takes some time to maybe work back from that and get to a point where you're in you're able to do your job, but there are the right sort of restrictions in place to protect yourself from yourself, in essence, but also protect your customers from the risk of issues coming through your infrastructure or your code base. That quote at the end there is really just a thing to keep in mind. Security researchers or professionals definitely have this mindset of how can I break this? How can I get past this? How can I exploit this? And that's very much true also for hackers. Hackers' motivations are very different, but embedding some of that mindset within your teams and within your organization can bring huge advantages in terms of your overall security and maturity. So I'm going to dive straight into what I call the basics. There's a few different subjects here, but the first one is really around authentication or authorization. So if you're working on something which requires access control or various different levels of privilege depending to access certain parts of the system, then you really need to understand the basics of authorization and authentication. So the difference between the two really, so authn is shorthand for authentication, is really just a way of saying I am who I say I am. So it's sort of typically seen through login type processes and flows. And then auth-z or auth-z, depending on where you're from, is the next layer of that is really about saying I have access to the resources that I'm allowed to access, and not the resources that I'm not allowed to access, more importantly. Some tips about this really is don't roll your own, don't create your own authentication or authorization frameworks or protocols. It's use industry standard and recommended ones. If you're using password-based authentication, try and drive your users towards using more secure mechanisms. So FIDO2, WebAuthn enable password-less, password-only logins to be replaced with more secure, faster experiences like passwordless, like security keys or biometrics, like fingerprint and stuff like that. And don't assume a user is authorized, validate that they really are. And this is something that I have seen in the wild multiple times now, where one user who is authenticated can access another user's data. Really make sure when you're writing the code that you really know who is accessing the data, and that they're accessing the right data. Next up, in what I sort of consider some of the basics, is encryption. This is a whole huge subject, but I just want to sort of point out the signpost, the times when you should be encrypting. The very short answer would be all the time, but at the very least you should be encrypting anything which is sensitive. So any configuration, connection strings, access keys and that sort of thing, any personally identifiable information, payment details, anything sensitive to the business, may not be customer data, but other sort of sensitive data, basically anything that a hacker might want to get hold of. And yeah, as I mentioned, the when or where you should encrypt it really is end-to-end, as much as possible. So using things like TLS for communication between endpoints to secure your traffic, your data, and then at rest, so wherever it's stored. So using things like disk encryption, hashing, or two-way encryption. And then the other sort of real big basic fundamental thing that I think you need to look at implementing is logging, monitoring, alerting. If you haven't got good logging, monitoring, and alerting in place, you can't really. It's very difficult to move forward and mature your overall processes and systems. So essentially, you can't see what you don't log. You can't see issues if you're not watching them, so that's the monitoring side, and equally you can't react if you're not warned. So building in good logging, monitoring, alerting is such an important thing, and should be thought about in every line of code almost that you're writing, or maybe not line, but every feature or function that you're writing. Think about it. Does it need some logging? Does it need some alerting if something goes wrong, and that sort of thing? Really, really important, and even more so when you're dealing with security, because you to be able to detect someone attacking your system is a vital advantage. If you don't know it's happened or happening, then you stand very little chance of protecting yourself going forward. So next up is more around sort of protecting your systems on the peripheral. There's more than 4 ways of doing this, but the sort of key ones that I wanted to talk about are sort of primarily virtual networks. So when you're deploying your application somewhere into your own infrastructure or into the cloud, think about how you can segregate or isolate the resources, and use firewalls to filter or route the traffic around from both external traffic, but also internally. You can configure it to route it all, and that's really to protect, say, a database from being accessible from the public web and things like that. So really lock it down so only traffic can come to the database can go to this can come from this service, for example. Next up are content delivery networks. So a couple of examples, Akamai or Cloudflare, are two of the really big ones. So these provide caching on the edge, so they can cache some of the responses that your services, your app, websites or APIs respond with, and that in turn will reduce the load on your service and therefore reduce your risk to denial of service type attacks. But in addition, CDNs tend to offer enhanced protection, so sort of broader DDoS protection, bot detection and protection as well. So really, really useful things to consider. And one tip around if you are looking at or if you do use CDNs is make sure that at your origin or on your actual service which is sitting behind the CDN, make sure that you set that up so that it only accepts traffic from the content delivery network. So you could use headers or whatever to secure that. But what that means is that you can mitigate the risk of someone bypassing the CDN and going straight to your service. A note on automated patching: depending on how you're deploying your applications and where you're deploying them to, just always make sure that automated patching, especially or at least at an operating system level, is enabled. But equally, make sure you remember if you're using third-party software on your services or on your servers or other dependencies, make sure that they're kept up to date as well. There are almost daily new vulnerabilities being published, so and patches for those typically come out the same day or within a few days. So keeping on top of those can really make a big difference to your overall protection. And finally, a little note on TLS, HTTPS, if you're not familiar. So TLS is transport level security protocol, and it's used for encrypting data between endpoints. Really, the recommendation nowadays is shouldn't just be considered for public networks, but also try and use it internally within communication between your own endpoints as well. If you can do it, there's an extra layer of protection there for you. So next up, note around hardening your application itself. So this is where I want to talk a bit more about the overall software development lifecycle and how you can really supplement that with enhanced security practices. So one of the things that we're doing at ASOS and in the industry generally is introducing more tools like dependency scanners. So essentially what they do is they will look at your project files or containers, build an index of all the dependencies in there, and then they'll look up those dependencies, the specific versions of them, and against databases to say, okay, well, are there any known vulnerabilities for those? And then they report that back to you. And these are really useful for getting very fast feedback within your development process around if you're bringing in, introducing new dependencies or even existing ones where there's potential issues with them. So there's a few examples at the bottom: Sneak, Dependabot, NSP, and a couple of others, but there's loads out there. Those are just calling out a few depending on what tech stack you're using, but definitely recommend making use of these sorts of tools. In addition to that, I highly recommend looking at SAST tools. So SAST stands for Static Application Security Testing. And these sorts of tools are static code analysis tools. So they actually look at the code that you've written, and they look for things like configuration, where you've left API keys or connection strings in there, which you obviously shouldn't be storing in your code base. But they also look at for patterns like SQL injection, vulnerabilities, and cross-site scripting and stuff like that, and report that out to you. So again, it's an automated layer of security there, which will hopefully flag up some of the low-hanging fruit. Quite a recent vulnerability that was introduced, published about a month or so ago, was a thing called Trojan Source. I'm not an expert on this one, but it's a really interesting one which was highlighted. So essentially, it's where you're hiding potentially malicious code within your code base without it being easily detected by humans. So it uses homoglyphs, which utilizes things like homoglyphs, which is where they're Unicode characters that look visually similar to others. So it may look like one word, but actually it's using completely different letters. So it could be, you create a duplicate of a method which looks the same visually, but actually gets called by the compiler or the interpreter and processed differently. So there's a really good website linked at the bottom, which I highly recommend having a read of. And I think from that website you can get to the GitHub repo, where there's some really interesting examples in a number of different programming languages. So I highly recommend having a look at that. One note on this is hopefully a lot of the SAS tools and dependency scanning tools should have updated the rule sets by now to look out for this sort of thing and warn for it. But yeah, it's just an interesting one to throw into the mix. Another area that you can improve your security mindset and knowledge is around OWASP training. So OWASP, if you've not heard of it, is it's like an online community of security professionals, and they share, they create tools and they share documentation and collate data around the types of issues that are occurring in the security world. And what they do is they compile lists of top 10 lists of the top 10 types of vulnerability for a particular type of application. So the two main ones would be the web top 10 and the API top 10. So get familiar with those, have a start at their website, a really good resource, but get familiar with those. As an engineer, it's been really, really useful to actually understand what the types of attacks are that people typically expose themselves to. So have a look at getting that sort of training, or at least just getting the fundamentals understood across your development teams. It's really, really useful. And in addition to that, OWASP publishes some really great tools on GitHub. So check some of those out. I'll mention one of them later on, but yeah, a really, really good organization, and it's pretty much all free to access. So check it out. Another thing that another process that people may not be so familiar with is red, blue, and purple teaming. And really, that's what that talks about, is this sort of simulations of attacks and how you respond to attacks. So this is a practice that is I wouldn't suggest introducing until you're fairly mature in your security mindset and culture, but it's something that certainly elements of it you could introduce early on. So the red teaming side, which is akin to getting penetration tests carried out, is where you get an experienced team of attackers trying to exploit the system. So very much like a pen test. But these could be an internal team if you've got the skill set in your organization. So blue team is the sort of other side of the fence as such. So it's where you get your incident response team trying to detect and mitigate and prevent attacks. And that blue team extends right through even into your software development lifecycle. So you can simulate attacks and how you respond to those all through your development lifecycle. Doesn't just have to be on the public facing side of things. And then purple teaming is a kind of blended approach where you actually get a red teamer, so an expert attacker or an experienced attacker, to sit with the incident response team and work with them while they simulate attacks and understand how to respond to it. So that's a really good way of building the knowledge and experience of an incident response team by bringing in a professional attacker, so they can actually sit with them and ask questions and get really good input into understanding the types of attacks and how to detect them and so forth. I mean, this is such a big subject. There are, this is another list of other things to look at really and consider. IAM really is part of the fundamentals, but identity and access management is really about making sure that access control within your organization is well done, making sure that people don't have too many privileges, more than they need, and looking at things like just-in-time access for when you do need elevated privileges. Don't have it all the time, just get granted it when you need it. Look at external penetration testing of your applications, really valuable. I don't always recommend using the same company every year if you're doing an annual type of thing, because it's sometimes good to bring in a fresh set of eyes. Look at some of the automated pen testing tools as well. A lot of the ones I've listed here you can actually integrate into your pipelines and get feedback on your websites or your APIs around some of the potentially low-hanging fruit, and get that feedback before it hits production. Look at bug bounty schemes. So you could run those internally or externally through partner websites like Integrity. This is a great way of incentivizing the security mindset and the culture of looking for these things. So yeah, definitely worth considering. Also look at security training. So especially if you want to be a security champion or are one already, but even for ASOS, actually, most of our engineers are getting security training rolled out through Secure Code Warrior, where you get to look at simulated, you get to look at code which has vulnerabilities in it, and then you actually get to also look at how to mitigate those issues. So it's a really good resource. There are other companies out there offering similar training, but it's something I think most engineers would benefit from. But at the very least, if you've got security champions, try and get them to look at this sort of training. And if you as an individual get a bit of an appetite for the security side of things and start getting really into it, then you could also look at pen testing certifications. There's a few listed there, but there's many others, and they're a really good way of getting a very broad but also in-depth understanding of the types of attacks and the vulnerabilities and exploits and how to look for things. So really valuable. And finally, even if you are a bit more of have a casual interest in it, try practicing, try some of these hacks and learning a bit more about it. Try Hack Me is a really excellent resource. Hack the Box is great as well, but Try Hack Me especially has got excellent beginner pathways. A lot of it's free, so check it out, and you can actually legally hack boxes, which is really fun. So there's a lot there in a very small amount of time, but the key takeaway is really around this is to look at building a security first mindset into your teams. It does require buy-in from the top. It's not something that you can just introduce, I think, within an isolated team. There's so many areas to cover. You can't just pick one or two of these things that I've mentioned. You really need to look at it quite holistically and have a bit of a plan as to how you can introduce all, if not most, if not all of the things I've mentioned. But yeah, you need some buy-in, I think, from the top to really help drive that forward and get the right sort of support to make it happen. Integrate these sort of security practices as early as possible into your life cycle. you get faster feedback, and hopefully you can protect yourselves from releasing things into the wild which have vulnerabilities. Make use of automation, but equally don't rely on automation. The automation out there is great, and it's getting better all the time, but it won't completely protect you. There are things that humans are just better at doing, especially breaking things. So don't rely entirely on it. And finally, drill it home, nail the fundamentals first, get your logging in place, get your access control management, get your encryption and stuff in place, and get your authorization and authentication in place. If you've got that, you've got a good foundation to then build on your security practices as a whole. There you go. You're muted, Rob.
Classic. Thanks very much for that, Steve. That was really good. Yeah, I really like the detail in all that, and really well sort of easy to follow, I guess. So I'll just say for everyone's benefit, if you've got questions, just add them into the chat function, and well, I'll get these questions out to Steve. I've got some questions myself though that I'll run through whilst we wait for any questions to come in. I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you, Steve, is more about like just how you got into it in the first place. Because do you feel like this is accessible to just any software engineer?
Yes, it is. I think it depends how far down the rabbit hole you want to go, and that's, I think, driven a lot by passion. So for me, when I was at university, it was actually when I was at university, I said to myself, I want to work in cybersecurity, and I didn't. I left uni, got a job somewhere else, and sort of always had that interest, but didn't actually do anything with it as such. And it's only really in recent years where I've worked closely. The last few years, I've been working really closely at ASOS with the identity side of things, so our identity and customer data, and really the APIs that provide those functions for the business, and that's really reignited my passion for security, because it's so vital to get it right in that area, especially when you're dealing with, well, we've got 25 million active customers per month, so we kind of need to make sure we're protecting them and their data. So that's really reignited that passion and led me to sort of go deeper on this. But yeah, any engineer can start with it. I think we did some OWASP training a few years ago, and that was really fun, really interesting, and it wasn't a big time commitment to get some of those fundamentals in place in terms of knowledge. So I would say at the very least, start somewhere like that where you can kind of get a bit of a taster for it. But if you want to go deeper on it, things like Try Hack Me, as I mentioned it near the end, those sort of safe spaces to practice and learn some of the skills and techniques that hackers use are really fun, really rewarding, and legal as well. Yeah, definitely don't try and run any of those tools that against other websites without their permission. Disclaimer.
No, of course, absolutely. So I guess also in terms of how you thinking about the way in which you and the team work on this sort of stuff, how did you guys actually, and this goes, I suppose, for software engineers across ASOS now, how have you sort of set the standards for engineers to, okay, so every engineer knows exactly what the coding standards are with security in mind?
Yeah, so we have an application security team at ASOS whose sole focus is around how we can it's around defining what those standards are. And I've been working very closely with them to then look at the practical element of, okay, well, this is where we want to be, or this is the sort of level or standard that we want people to adhere to. How do we actually practically implement that? and coming from an engineering background means that I'm coming in with maybe a different mindset to the pure security background, who maybe doesn't have the hands-on experience of developing software. So I work with them and others, not just me exclusively, but myself and some other sort of security champions, I suppose, are working with that team to formulate practical approaches to implementing things. So in some cases, so with the dependency scanning as an example, we're working on, or we have been working with ways of implementing that in a passive way, so that it'll scan everyone's code with or repos when they make a commit or push up a commit without them having to do anything. Other things that we've done in the past is training. So there's a bigger version of this deck that I've showed you today, which I've put together, where I go a little bit more in depth, and it's a bit more specific to how we do things at ASOS. And I've been rolling that out across ASOS as well, to get people on the same page and thinking about these things day to day a bit more. But yeah, there's no sort of one way of doing it. I think you kind of it helps having engineers involved in the process rather than it just being security dictating something. It's better to involve your engineers and get some sort of people who are passionate about engineering and security to work together with security as a whole to kind of make it happen in a more digestible and acceptable way.
Sure. So when you do sort of code reviews with some of your engineers, are you sort of feeding back on sort of their security considerations as well?
So we aren't looking at. I don't go and look at everyone's code review, and then we just don't have time to do that. So that's where we're trying to get the teams thinking about that a lot more.
Yeah.
We're introducing tools like Veracode or other sort of SaaS tools as well to supplement and take some of the mental load, I guess, away from the engineers themselves, because ultimately you want engineers to be able to focus on delivering features and fixing issues. You don't want to burden them with too many other responsibilities, and that's the balance that we're trying to achieve there. Is how do we improve the overall security stature of a team or an engineer and of a team without burdening them, making them all professional hackers basically on top of their day job. So it's quite a tricky one. I wouldn't say we're there yet completely, but we're on the journey to kind of trying to achieve that.
Sure. And we've got a few questions from the audience. So there's a couple from Vladislav. The first one was, what approach do you use to access secrets, Key Vault, Managed Identity?
Yep. So actually, those are two parts that I've knocked off of this deck, just because in the interest of time. We're in Azure. We're very much focused on Microsoft Azure for our hosting and management of our infrastructure. So Key Vault is where I would suggest, where we suggest storing any secrets, and utilizing managed identity. Managed identity is great because it takes away some of the hassle of managing the managing the identity, managing the secrets and the credentials of a service, and allowing it to communicate with others, so authenticate and authorize itself against other services. So we strongly suggest using things like managed identity to authenticate against your Key Vault to then pull down the secrets that you need for your application. Like that's the sort of the template, I guess, or the starting point.
Sure.
So yeah, absolutely. Use Key Vault is generally the recommendation.
Sure, of course. And how do you tackle errors coming from static code analysis? Do you check them on the PR stage?
Yep. So typically, yeah, there's two types of scan that we typically run. So one would be normally at a PR stage. So that will check and give you feedback straight away. It's normally quite a quick scan to give you feedback around any issues. We don't often log the report from that. It will just get output in the build so that people can see it and react to it. Once the code has been merged, we'll then scan it again. Normally, for compliance reasons, we want to keep that logged somewhere. So, as an example, with Veracode, you can have what's called a policy scan, where it will analyze the code and then log it and keep it. You can follow like historical trends of that code base then and see whether it's adhering to compliance standards and stuff like that. So yeah, in terms of if an error comes back, if it finds an issue, it's depending on the severity or the type of policy that you have within your organization, you need to decide whether you still allow that to progress through the delivery pipeline, or do you block it and say, no, you need to fix this now. There's different ways of tackling that. You could have a rule based on the severity of it. So anything which is high or critical, maybe you want to say, don't allow that through. It needs to be fixed there and then. Or you might have some sort of grace period where you say, okay, well, we acknowledge that there's an issue there, but you have, I don't know, 10 days or something to remediate it, as an example.
Mm-hmm. Sure, of course. And we've got a good question from Praveen. Security is not generally considered for MVP, and so same gets carried for a product due to time constraints brought by management, marketing, etc. How do we handle this elegantly?
It's the age-old battle, isn't it, of security versus delivery. And I think this is where I come back to the point that I made about you need buy-in from the top. You need people within the business, high up in the business, to really understand the value of security and the protections that it provides. The cost, it depends on the type of service or systems you're building, but I mean, if you're dealing with customer data or payment data or anything like that, if you're not implementing good security practices, you are exposing yourself to potentially business crippling fines. You know, GDPR is I think it's something like 40% of your gross income as a business. That's before tax, and I think that's the sort of maximum fine you can receive. So if that, you know, often people don't care about security until they get hit by it. Yep. But if being bitten by it is definitely not something that your company could easily recover from in most cases. So it's just something to be really wary of. And yeah, in practical sense, I don't know how you handle this without that buy-in. It's something that I think you need to have very frank and open conversations with, and really work with the stakeholders to agree on what the minimum standards are, not just from a viable product, but also from a minimum security standard as well, and have maybe start there as you know, this is our MVP from a product perspective, but this is our MVP from a security perspective as well, and these are the thresholds that we need to achieve to be able to deliver it, not just one of the two.
Yeah, of course, and just getting stakeholders to actually think more about the consequences as to, well, what are we going to do if this goes wrong, and tends to sharpen the minds when money's brought in, doesn't it?
Yes.
And,
yeah. If you can put a monetary value against anything, it makes
yes.
it a lot more real for people up top. So
yes, absolutely.
Try and do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess one other thing that I was going to ask you as well is, obviously you mentioned a lot of good tools there, and people might sort of watching this think, oh, well, that's all well and good for ASOS. They've got loads of money. I work for a startup, and you know, we don't have money to burn. So, you got any thoughts about sort of how you can do some of this sort of stuff at, you know,
yeah, absolutely.
cost?
So actually, a lot of the tools that I've mentioned are free and open source. Mm-hmm. So and I would generally lean towards a lot of those over the paid ones. yes, we do supplement that with some paid tools and things like that. So they do have some advantages. But as a starting point, start with the open source world. There's tons of stuff on GitHub. Start with OWASP as a good resource. But things like Sneak, Dependabot is basically built into GitHub now. So if you're publishing your code there, you can have it automatically detect and even create a pull request for you with the fix, automatically, and you just need to check it, approve it, and then it's fixed it for you. So yeah, there's tons of open source ones, and the majority of the ones that I've mentioned actually are open source.
Sure, of course. And I guess just to give you a bit of an open goal, Steve, are ASOS hiring for sort of security interested engineers at the moment?
I think, yeah, well, we have loads of engineering vacancies, and anyone with a passion in security is a bonus, really. But anyone who's passionate about engineering is people that we want on board, really. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there are opportunities with a bit more of a security focus, but I'm not aware of any specific ones. If I'm honest, I hadn't done my research there, I'm afraid. But absolutely, yeah, there's tons of vacancies in terms of engineering as a whole. So
Sure. We'll tell the we won't tell the recruitment team that you weren't prepped on that. It's all right. We'll keep that to ourselves. But yeah, I really appreciate your time and obviously putting this talk together for us. I thought it was really good, and
thank you.
I'm sure everyone will have enjoyed it as well. So I'm just going to wrap things up by sort of saying that we are looking to obviously get back to in-person events. Fingers crossed. There's no lockdown come Christmas in January. Come 2022. But yeah, we'll obviously be updating the meetup group as soon as we've got some confirmation as to when we can get going on those sort of things. So keep tabs on the meetup group. Likewise, I say again, follow us on all the socials, and we'll keep you updated on all that sort of stuff and when the next meetup is, whether it's again virtual or in person. So I wish you all the best evening, and yeah, we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Bye bye.